This building in The Hague, in the Netherlands, houses the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. And over there across the street is the Institute for Environmental Security. One of the people working at the Institute is a remarkable woman named Femke Wijdekop. Femke is a lawyer, an author, and a broadcaster. She's a dedicated worker in the movement to have ECOCIDE brought within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which is also in The Hague, along with such other heinous offenses as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. She also works with Facing Crossroads, a foundation devoted to the recognition of the intrinsic value of the earth and its ecosystems. But her particular passion is the defense of environmental defenders, the citizen activists around the world who resist the onslaught of megacorporations bent on destroying established communities, both human and non-human, in the naked pursuit of profit. Every week, she says, many such environmental defenders are tortured, raped, and beaten, and every week, 2 are murdered. And law, up until now, it really has been in the service of exploiting the natural
Absolutely.
world, not protecting it.
Yeah,
Right?
and that the protection is at the margins or of the system, you know. But the logic of thinking is still one of seeing the earth as an object. Our relationship to the earth is one of ownership. We can exploit unless there are rules that say this piece of land is protected, you know. But the basic rule is that the earth is an object and we are the owner. That is the baseline. You call it like that, right? That is the ground way of thinking.
Which, when you think about it, is a very, very odd thing, isn't it? I mean, if the earth was here before we were, the earth will be here after we're gone. How can we be said to own it when we are actually its creations and we're temporary and it's permanent?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very recent way of thinking too. I mean, this really came with the roots you can be traced before the Industrial Revolution and before the Age of Enlightenment. Some people even trace it to the to Christianity and some Greek philosophers. You know, the first roots of feeling that we are more separated from nature, we are more masters of nature. But I think the worst came with the, Industrial Revolution. We got the means to actually, have this mindset, but also put it to use in the world. Actually, we have to give hands and feet to it.
I think we've already started.
Yeah, I'm just babbling, you know.
No,
so.
not at all. I just thought this,
warming up.
I'm glad we're running here, but let me take you back to the well. There's a couple of points that you've already raised. One of them is you started out as a lawyer, and then you stopped being a lawyer. Tell me and then you became a lawyer again.
Right.
So tell me what happened in that evolution.
I studied law at the University of Amsterdam, and from law school I went straight to the academic world. I started a PhD on constitutional and international law. And it was a subject that had my intellectual interest, and it was handed to me. And I thought it was interesting, and I was very open. I was quite eager to learn. I loved to study. I was 23, so I started doing that. But at one point in my life, I also had some inner changes. The way I looked at the world, it was changing, and I was wondering what I was really doing with that subject, because it was a very, specific study subject, as PhD proposals often are. And I didn't see how it would really help to make the world a better place, or to what it would be its value to society. So for me, in that point of my life, I felt no inner drive to do it. And I tried to finish it. I tried to still do it and to add a little bit more of my new thinking into it, but it didn't work, because I was still, in this research paradigm, and I had to be within the boundaries of that paradigm and that way of thinking, which was about constitutional law, attribution of state powers to international organizations. And at that point I didn't have any soul for me, so that's why I decided to stop with it, because I felt I couldn't really defend it and own it, that it was my own, that I really stood for it. And then as a student, I'd worked at the American Book Center for some years. It was a lovely place, a big bookstore in the center of Amsterdam. And there, so all of a sudden, there was a position free to become the buyer of books on consciousness, spirituality, and ecology. And at that moment, it was perfect for me because I was very much interested in those subjects about how our own consciousness influences how we act, with others in the world, and how we engage with the world, and the power of our own beliefs, etc. So I took that position, and I spent many happy years there, 5 years more or less. And I also noticed that I took with me the experience I had gained at the university, as in I started to host a spiritual book club. I started to, not teaching, but I started to host events and to discuss with others the materials we read. And I started to organize book signings with authors, and doing interviews also with authors, because it was quite easy to have access to national and international authors, because we were in touch with publishers, with the big publishers from the US. And in that way, I started to actually see myself as a communication channel, to communicate information from America and England to mainland Europe, and do that in the field of consciousness and spirituality. So that was a phase in my life that I was very much interested in, that side of life. And then I was doing this radio show. It was called Samen, which means together. And we were illuminating all sorts of initiatives in Amsterdam that were contributing to a society that was more, where people felt more connected to each other, that focused more on what we have in common, that focused more on how can we build each other up, how can we realize that we are, citizens in one country, in one city. So the focus was really on, trying to be an agent for good in society and in the world. And we interviewed lots of authors and people who did all sorts of positive things. It generated a lot of positive energy, and that was great. And at one point, a friend of mine said, well, I was in London at the Hub. This is this sort of place where you can rent a desk for a small amount of money, and you can work with other entrepreneurs, and they will have inspiring speakers or events. And she said, I saw Polly Higgins there, and she was there with Charles Eisenstein, who's also a very interesting author who writes about sharing economy, sacred economics. And she said, you should check out this Polly Higgins, because she talks about law in a very new way, and she talks about making ecocide a crime against peace, and she talks about we owe a duty of care towards the earth. And at first I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting, but also a little bit utopian, even though of course I was really immersed in all this quite idealistic stuff and utopian thinking, some would say, but part of me felt maybe a little bit skeptical that something like that could be possible in law. But she told me, just watch her TED Talk, so I checked it out, and I was like, wow, this is really very interesting, and it's really rooted in law. I mean, it's really making a connection between a more holistic worldview, a worldview where we are in relationship with the earth instead of owning the earth, a worldview where we recognize earth has intrinsic value, to how can we do that within the current system. It was really bridging the more ideal world with how can we get there from where we are right now, and also showing that this way of thinking is not something new, that actually already in 1970 there were people talking about making ecocide a crime against peace. So I saw that TED Talk, and something in me shifted. It was as if something in me woke up. I felt excited. I said, if this is what law looks like, I want to be part of the world of law again. I read her book, and then I contacted her team because I wanted to interview her for the radio. And we did an interview, and she noticed that I was also understanding the legal background, and it was a great conversation. And I said, we got to invite you to Amsterdam, and you should give a workshop here, because I was also involved in hosting workshops and giving workshops. And it should be an Earth Guardian training, because I felt, yeah, this information that I want to spread it, but also what can individual people do? How can individuals become an Earth Guardian? So that's how I started organizing that, and I heard about a European team. It's called End ECOCIDE in Europe. It was started by a German woman called Priska Merz, and she once heard Polly Higgins speak about this subject, and she was also triggered. She also said, inspired. She said, I gotta do something with that. And she was really into student movements and, you know, the European Student Movement Organization, and connecting European students for, you know, certain goals and aspirations. And she said, we can now organize a European Citizens Initiative under the EU law. So with the Treaty of Lisbon, there was a new provision which said that European citizens can, if they gather 1 million signatures, they can propose legislation to the European Commission. So Priska decided to have such an initiative on the subject of ECOCIDE. And then I was told about this, that we could actually become part of this European Citizens Initiative and start to, you know, see if we can have votes and if we could have people engaged with that. And this office, the Institute for Environmental Security, was the headquarters in the Netherlands for that effort. So that's how I became active with the End ECOCIDE movement. And we had the workshop with Polly Higgins, and then I got connected to this place, and I started to do research into this subject of ECOCIDE law, and also into the right to a healthy environment, how we could give that hand and feet in law. And basically that's how I got involved in law again. Yeah, that's what's the start of it.
It's a fascinating mechanism that the citizens are able to come up with an idea that they want to have included in the legal system.
Meant to give more, to introduce more direct democracy in the European mechanism. But at the same time, the thresholds are quite high, or the requirements for people signing up and supporting it, quite technical. So with ECOCIDE, we didn't reach the 1 million votes, unfortunately, because out of every 5 visitors to the petition website, only 1 signed the petition, because you had to fill in, for many countries, you had to fill in your passport number, your ID, you had to fill in, a code that appears to make sure you're not a computer but a human, and people would get error notifications. So they wanted more direct democracy, but they didn't make it very easy. So that was one of the reasons that the initiative didn't make it to the 1 million hit. But at least it was discussed at a commission of the European Parliament, and so European parliamentarians have heard of it. And this group, End ECOCIDE in Europe, later fused into the End ECOCIDE on Earth movement. That was 1 year ago, with people and academics and lawyers and doctors and everyone who wanted to join from other countries as well, willing to take this further and to really help raise awareness about the need to make ecocide a crime, but also lobby politicians or write academic publications, just whatever the person, him or herself, feels is within his or her reach. Yeah, so it's the people, they feel they resonate with this idea that the massive damage and destruction of ecosystems should be considered an international crime, and that the earth is worthy to be protected and defended, and that right now we cannot do that in the right way, because there's the punishment for destroying ecosystems is not severe enough in general for the perpetrators, which are often companies, multinationals, to really change their model of making money.
And at this stage, it's mostly national too, right? You would be offending, and you would be applying a national law against an offense of this kind. You don't have an international law, right? It's not an international crime; it's a national crime if it's a crime at all.
That's right. Well, within Europe, there is some regulation on environmental crimes, for poaching, amongst others, and for some pollution crimes. But that is it's covering only a small part of environmental crimes and not the whole of it, while ECOCIDE looks at damage of destruction of ecosystem on a massive scale. It's not for every sort of damage, because then you have to also have definition and how do you call that, thresholds, right? But there is no international prohibition of ecocide, and even if you would make a law on a national level, well, we live in an international globalized world, so I mean other foreign companies could still do it on your territory, or your own companies, which is more the case in Western Europe, that they actually cause ecocides in non-Western world. It's an international phenomenon which needs international regulation, also because companies feel that if we have to abide by that law, but other big companies, our competitors, don't, this is not, we cannot do that. There's this how do you call that, unfair competition or that argument? Yeah.
We should probably stop for a moment here and talk about what ecocide is and what it isn't. I mean, when you first hear the phrase, at least my experience was when you first hear the phrase, I thought this is the whole thrust of our period, or, of our time on the earth, is we're committing a massive elimination of life forms globally, and that's what the word must mean. But that's not what you mean when you're talking about in terms of law. You're talking about something that's pretty large, but it's definable, right? Tell me about that. Tell me where the limits are.
To define it, so it would be an ecocide is a massive damage and destruction of ecosystem which lasts for at least one season, so for at least 3 months, and that has a grave impact, and that the territory of the ecocide is 700 miles. That's the definition, or those are the thresholds of the Environmental Modification Convention. So what Polly Higgins has done is she has looked at existing law already outlawing actually environmental damage, but then on a very specific subject, and she has used that as a good example of the thresholds that need to be there, because you've got to have that in law, otherwise it creates a situation of legal uncertainty. If you don't know, it's a principle of legality, you've got to know what conduct is permissible and what is prohibited. Examples of ecocides are the Chevron oil spill in Ecuador, or the Deep Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or the Niger Delta oil spill in Nigeria, or many people would say that fracking, which causes pollution of the ground and the groundwater on massive scales, are examples of ecocide, or the Fukushima nuclear disaster, or overfishing of the oceans where the fish stock is completely gone. So you've got to really think at major environmental disasters. Yeah.
We have one of those in our part of Canada, and that's the virtual destruction of the cod stocks. What was once one of the great fisheries of the world is now basically gone. And nothing has happened. Nobody's been held responsible. 40,000 people have lost their jobs, entire communities have closed down, and nothing has happened to anybody. But that was done all by human agency and under human supervision.
Right, yeah. So that's the problem with the legal system as it is. It doesn't offer real protection for actually massive infringement of the natural world, but also affecting human rights. I mean, affecting the human right to employment, for example. But often these sorts of ecocides, they affect the human right to health and the human right to life, and people have to be displaced because their territory is gone. So there is a real connection between destruction of the environment and us destroying our own health and our own well-being, obviously. And these interests, the interests of the people, especially the people who are the first to face with those kind of disasters, to deal with that, often indigenous peoples, and the interests of the earth and the animals, they are not represented in law as they should be. That is the whole problem. They don't have enough voice. That is the whole problem. And ecocide law is a proposal which aims to give a voice to those interests. And there's other proposals too, like the wild law movement, like the movement to give rights to Mother Earth, as the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature does. So I see it as an expression, as several expressions of a consciousness that understands that nature has intrinsic worth and value, and that law is an instrument to give expression to interests that are worthy to be protected, that have a voice in our political system and in our society. So now you see people standing up, lawyers standing up, that want to give voice to those interests, as Roger Cox did when he started the climate case, the Urgenda climate case, saying that the Dutch state had a duty of care to lower CO2 emissions to prevent too much CO2 emissions and the relation to climate change. He was representing the interest of the Dutch and even, of course, the global citizens, because this affects all of us, but also thinking about future generations, that what are we leaving to our children's children, what are we leaving for future generations. So it's coming from a more broader view of, what are we doing, who is it affecting, and who needs guardians? The earth needs a guardian, and future generations needs guardians. So in my view, this is all very connected, all these different lawyers speaking up in different ways. For me, it's connected.
Well, we've seen the globalization of the economy. Mm-hmm. In a sense, now we're seeing a matching globalization of conscience and awareness, right?
Yeah, I see it that way for sure. And this is how my own interest in, let's say, consciousness, spirituality, that was all for me about a realization we are interconnected beings, we are part of one organism, which is the earth. And this is reflected back in this initiative to make ecocide a crime, and this initiative to give rights to nature. And these ideas, they sprout everywhere around the world. And I was just talking to a recent member of our ECOCIDE team, and he said, years ago, me and a friend of mine, we discussed this, and we said, Mother Earth should have rights too. We should not only have a universal declaration of the rights of man, but also of the rights of the earth. And I said, wow, yeah. And at the same time, Cormac Cullinan in South Africa was thinking the same, and this has been, Mumta Ito was also realizing the same. It's like ideas whose time have come, they sprout into minds that are receptive, that are open for inspiration and willing to be of service, to be a solution to the problems we see. Yeah. Well,
this is a little theme in your life too, is that you're really interested in how ideas like this spread,
Absolutely.
Right? And what's the process? And you have a good example right here at the moment with a television show, right?
Yeah, so...
Tell me about that.
Yeah, I would love to. When I joined the ECOCIDE in Europe team, another Dutch woman whose name is Katie, Olivia, she joined us too, and she immediately resonated with the whole idea. And we became, friends, and we became colleagues. And, she was there at the Earth Garden workshop with Polly Higgins. And then quite quickly she thought this subject has to be, this topic, ecocide, has to be the topic of a show of the TV program Tegenlicht, which means backlight, which is a TV show that really gives stage to progressive ideas that present solution to the problems in the world, the economic problems, the environmental problems. It's a very high quality program, reaches a lot of people, and it combines, I would say, smart thinking with creative outlook, and also focuses on solutions. And she accidentally met the director of this show, Backlight, and she pitched the idea, and she said to him, "Isn't that a great idea if you would follow Polly Higgins' work to get ecocide on the international agenda?" At first he had to think about it, but after some effort, and she can be quite, she can insist quite a lot, he actually said, well, this is interesting, let me look into it. And then he says, yes, I want to do it, because this is really a topic of these times, like how does that work? One woman got a great idea, people feel that she's right, but yet the system seems to be so opposite of all the values she's promoting, and how does that work with contacting politicians? And How does a movement like that happen, and what does it take for a head of state to say, I want to take it further? So we've been working with him, and after she pitched him the idea, the researcher of this program, he contacted me, and I gave him a lot of background information. I was super willing to give him the whole story because I've been in that for like 2 years, and so I always give him all my information. And last week, 1 week ago, they broadcast the television show, and it was very well received. It was beautifully done. It really captured the essence of this idea. So what we know is that we have a Green Party in Parliament. It's called the Animal Party, but it's a party that looks at environmental issues and also at human issues. I'm sure they've seen the program and they have heard of ECOCIDE law before. But at that moment, they felt ready to actually address this in Parliament because there is a new member from that party. He had his maiden speech in Parliament last week, and they were talking to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he addressed this topic. What does the Minister think about ECOCIDE law? Does the Minister think it should be prohibited that states and companies destroy the environment on a massive scale? And he said that we think it should, and we would like an answer, and if the Minister doesn't answer or agree, we might raise this as a topic for official voting in Parliament. And this is only one example of how this TV broadcast contributed to this topic being on the political agenda. It was a topic of discussion in the Netherlands, of public opinion discussion, but also in that atmosphere, the politician felt there was enough momentum for it to be put on the political agenda, and this would not have happened if you trace back the events, if my friend never had that idea and never felt brave enough to talk to the director and to insist, because she believed in it, then the program wouldn't be there, and not, 200,000 or 300,000 people wouldn't have learned about it. Maybe it would have come in another way that could be possible. But it just demonstrates that when you feel so alive, when you learn a new idea, when you feel so taken by it, it makes complete sense, and it makes your heart, open, and also it makes sense to your mind. And if you act upon it, things can happen that are not, you could not explain logically. There can be a conveying of people, and because of connections that you have, things can happen that can affect change in a bigger way. I really believe in that. I see it happening with my life, and with Polly's life, and with a lot of the people who are involved in this.
Well, in a sense, you can go. If you start with Polly and start pushing the chain of events out from there, tracing the chain of events from there, there's a line right from her to this discussion in the Parliament of the Netherlands, right? That's one straight cause and effect thing, right?
This is just the example of the Netherlands, but this is happening in Sweden too. And the End ECOCIDE on Earth group also presented the ECOCIDE proposal to the French President Hollande, and so discussed it with him and with other, politicians. And there's been also in Austria, I think there has also been an official, how do you call that? We call it motie, but if a member of parliament officially tables make a motion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
it. It makes a motion in parliament, and the parliament votes on it.
It happened in other countries too, and it's contributing to hopefully increasing gravity for this topic to be taken seriously if we're waiting for a government to take the step to publicly, internationally support it.
Okay, so one national government somewhere needs to take this. Is that the next step?
Yeah, because the aim of this campaign is to make ECOCIDE a crime against peace under the Rome Statute, which is the treaty of the International Criminal Court, which is located here in The Hague.
Across the street.
That is the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court is close by. So we have a few courts here in the city. For that to happen, one state has to propose this as an amendment to the treaty, to the Rome Statute. And then, of course, 2/3 of the countries, of the parties, have to agree for it to become an amendment. But the first step is to really officially have it presented and this to be initiated. So that's why we are working to make that happen. And this week, the yearly assembly of the member states of the International Criminal Court is taking place in The Hague. So this is quite an exciting time for us, because we're trying to make that happen. Yeah.
And with that, so the process would be a state proposes this as an amendment, it becomes a subject of discussion and debate, and finally perhaps it gets adopted. Then it's part of the Constitution of the European Union, right? Basically?
No, because the International Criminal Court is a international body. It's not European, it's international. Canada is part of the ICC too. I think there are like 123 countries are member states of the International Criminal Court.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then it becomes a global thing with some states are not party to it, but
that's
most
it.
are.
Yeah, of course there are challenges, like some states that you would want to have on board are not party to it, but at the same time we think this is a good start as well, to have it really put in on the highest level, because the crimes that the International Criminal Court can prosecute are recognized as the crimes against peace, the worst crimes,
Like
existing.
genocide,
Genocide, war crimes, crimes of aggressions, crimes against humanity. And I'm not sure if you know, but ECOCIDE was on their way to become part of that. It was actually meant to be part of the Rome Statute, but it was removed from the draft treaty text in the 90s. Only now we have a provision that environmental damage and destruction is prohibited under war times, but the thresholds are very high, and it's only in war times, and it's only directed at states, so it doesn't cover ecocides caused by multinationals, for example, and in reality it is more often caused by companies than it is by states, even though states can also be the perpetrators and also complicit because they allow for it to happen, or they profit actually by those kind of economic activities that make a lot of money, and at the expense of the environment.
What state is going to do that?
Well, there are several options, and of course I don't know. I know we're guessing here, but we're guessing. But the small island states in the Oceania, how do you call that? The Pacific,
Oceania, the
right?
Pacific Islands.
They are the ones that are faced with the imminent effects of climate change, the rising sea levels, the risk of losing their territory entirely due to natural disasters and be caused by climate change. So they would have a lot of interest. They would have a lot to gain if ecocide and climate crime is also ecocide, if that would become prohibited, and if states would have an international obligation to assist them when they are facing with such ecocides, when they are confronted with losing their territory and that they need assistance for migration actually to other countries. So that is part of the idea of ecocide as a climate crime, that states would have a duty of care to assist other territories who need to take emergency measures because of ecocides. Yeah, naturally caused ecocides can still allow for such an obligation because there's a connection with the economic activities that we have undertaken for so long, the contribution to climate change, etc.
Well, it's kind of a concrete embodiment of the idea that we are a single human family.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, this effort to have ecocide recognized as a crime, it's really about. If you see you know, you often have these pictures of, you see a forest, you see trees, and they all are separate trees, but underneath the roots are entwined. And ecocide thinking is the same kind of thinking, that we are all affected by what we do to our planet, and you know, and we will feel the consequences of those actions. Is really looking at the long-term consequences of human behavior and how it affects those who have, you know, done little to contribute to pollution, and who actually often live more in harmony with the earth than many of us. And it's taking responsibility for the effects of also of a worldview. I think the worldview is the main problem, that we are disconnected from nature in our thinking and acting. And ecocide says we are connected to nature, we are part of nature, we are a huge part of the problem, we can be part of the solution. So the people who get this, they want to be part of the solution, and I want to be part of the solution, and I love that I can use my legal skills and also communication experience to play my part in that. And I think the story of that TV program and the effect it had on people and on, you know, lawyers and intellectuals and artists and politicians is a great example, because I think maybe the biggest problem is that we feel we have no power, we feel disempowered, we feel hopeless in the face of those big injustices, but we have influence. And if we combine our thinking, if we combine our solutions, we can make a big thing happen. And you know, that's also the good side of we are connected, we are part of a bigger whole, that it does make a difference. Today I just read, the earth, I cannot do all the good that the earth needs, but the earth needs all the good that I can do. I really love that, because that just says it all. It's not an excuse to say, well, I cannot do it all, so I will do nothing. No, you gotta do what you gotta do.
And that brings us back in a way to the Urgenda case, because wasn't that the position that the government took, is that, look, we're a tiny piece of the problem, there's no point in us trying to take that level of responsibility, and the court's saying, you may be a small piece, but you are a piece.
Exactly,
right?
yeah, exactly, that's right. So the court said you have a responsibility to address your own contribution to the big problem. And the nice thing is that in building that case, Roger Cox, the Urgenda attorney, he was also quoting a jurisprudence from the United States, from a case, I think it was EPA versus Massachusetts, in which the American court said that you have a partial responsibility for your part in polluting the environment. So even in preparing that case, Roger Cox was using information from other parts of the globe to build his. And I think the fact that we could become co-litigants in that case, I became a co-litigant. This case was set up in a very inclusive way. It had to be a case of the people. And they also used social media in a great way, and they said, you know, we'll do this through crowdfunding, but we also want to do crowd litigation. If you have good arguments, if you have information, please share it with us. It can help us build the case. So using the collective intelligence of the people to present this case on behalf of the collective, I really loved it, and I really love it that they translated everything in English, the summons and all their paperwork, the 1,000 pages of preparation in English, and they just give it for free to other organizations in the world who want to start similar cases. And if we have that on our side, that kind of thinking, that kind of collaboration and creativity, I mean, that intelligence is bigger than the intelligence that wants to destroy and that is greedy. That is so hope-giving, you know.
I have the impression that the people involved with that case were quite aware that if they won it, it would make a worldwide ripple, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm also part of the case as a co-litigant. But for me, it was something that I thought, wow, okay, I will join that. It's wonderful. I was very proud that they were doing it. But I didn't dare to think beyond the verdicts. Even though I so much believe in the reasoning behind it, I was very surprised that we won. We were really surprised that we won, because it was a big break in the usual thinking of the courts, that they dared to interpret the duty of care in a more extensive way for us to have our right, you know, to have our case win. what can I say? I mean, we were there. I was there that day in court, and maybe there were 150 people, and there were some camera crews like yours. We didn't realize that it would be broadcast on BBC and on Al Jazeera and everywhere around the world. I mean, that was an amazing moment, and I'm excited that I read yesterday that in America a group of group of kids, they also won a case. It was the first time that they won a case.
They won?
Yeah.
I knew they were bringing
the case. They won at the Washington court, and they won, and the judge said that the state has a public trust obligation and a constitutional obligation to take care of to make sure that we have a right to a clean and healthy environment, and that the atmosphere is protected. So public trust, reasoning, and constitutional duty of the state to keep the atmosphere, in balance, and to think longer term on behalf of future generations. It just happened the day before yesterday.
Well, that's huge.
It's huge.
I knew about the case, but I didn't realize that there was a decision in it. Yeah.
And my friend from the US just texted me, she told me, and that was amazing. And of course, you can always look at the instances in which they lose, and the many politicians who don't want to endorse this. But I feel that it's so important to feel your attention to what works, and to really learn from what doesn't work, but especially also to build on what does work, and to also tell others. So about this case, I told Jan van der Veen, who you just interviewed as well, and many others, and they got really excited, and they are sharing it, because this just gives hopes to everyone, Yeah, and for us as part of the Urgenda case, it's very endearing in a way that people really got hopeful after what we did. Yeah.
Well, you made a comment about the ineffectiveness of the political process. I think that's maybe one of the most exciting things about all of this, is that the legal process basically goes back beyond today's politics to the principles on which the society is founded, and says, according to those root documents,
right,
according to that understanding of who we are as a people, you have to take this position. You have to do something about this issue, even though it may be politically unpopular.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
that I think is a huge change in consciousness. Right?
I would say so. And you never know why that happened. I can make all sorts of assumptions, but I do think that the more cases, like climate case victories there are, the more people who, talk from this more integrated perspective. It is affecting the collective thinking of the people, and this is part of our times. And law is also a body that is embedded in society. It is not separated from the consciousness. It's an expression of the consciousness, and it can regulate the consciousness, but it is embodied in it. It has its roots in it, and it will reflect. In the end, it has to reflect changes in thinking in society. It always has.
I've heard it described as the DNA of society.
I don't know about that, but I think it's very...
Well, the instructions for how things unfold are...
It's a framework, a very important framework for conduct, and framework for which interests are protected, and what can we expect, and what do we value, because criminal law really shows which values we hold so dear that they have to be protected by criminal enforcement. But of course, sometimes the crimes that make it into the criminal code are not always the ones that are the worst attacks on society. Sometimes there are certain lobby groups that have a strong vote and that have a lot of power. They can make their own interest heard and protected and represented. So I think a lot of this is about how can we make the voices heard of those who still have less power or who cannot speak for themselves. The whole idea of the Alliance for the Rights of Nature is we have to be the guardians for the natural world, because the natural world cannot speak for itself, but we are embedded in it. It's impossible to have a legal system disconnected from the natural laws and still functioning and still being sustainable. It's impossible, because we are totally dependent on the natural world in the end. So we're all trying to harmonize the two in our own specific way. Yeah.
You've just touched on something else that a large topic that I wanted to discuss with you, and that's what I take to be your other great passion, which is the defense of the defenders, the environmental defenders. Tell me about your work in that area.
Yeah, so I think that those people that are standing up and that are defending the earth, that are defending the integrity of ecosystems, we call them environmental defenders. And a UK-based NGO, which is called Global Witness, has done a lot to put their work on the international agenda because unfortunately it is very dangerous for environmental defenders, especially in countries that are rich in natural resources, to do their work, because by protecting the right to a clean and healthy environment and the right to life and the right to family life, they are often coming against interests of big corporations, extractive corporations that want to use those resources, ultimately for profit, of course, and for consumption purposes. So these environmental defenders, they are in a situation of facing, with the Goliath kind of opponents, and they're the little Davids, and they are even speaking out on behalf of other people too. Often they are the ones who first notice the effects of this extractive system and the climate change effects, and they are the first to feel it because they are often belonging to communities that are small-scale farmers and fishers and that live in more harmonious way with the earth, and they feel the effects of our system that treats the earth as a property, as a commodity the first. But when they speak up, they are faced with these forces that are really not wanting to stop these operations. So what we see is that it's a very dangerous activity. It's a very it's really crazy that the people are actually A+ citizens of a country in a way, because they actually stand up to protect the environment, which the state should do. The government should protect the environment as an obligation, as a duty towards its inhabitants, to take good care of its inhabitants and its territory. Environmental defenders, they are the ones who take that state role, that state function, and if the effect of their work is that they get killed, they get intimidated, they get harassed. I mean, according to the Global Witness reports, at least 2 environmental defenders every week are killed, but the real number is much higher because these reports, they didn't cover many African countries because of not enough information, and of course they could only rely upon the official police records, etc. So we see that this system is crushing the people that are a voice on behalf of their community and on behalf of their ecosystems. So what is very essential is that they are protected to their work, that we defend those who defend the earth. Yeah.
And the problem, as you pointed out, is enormous. I mean, you tend to think of someone in the developed world that, well, it would cause you great discomfort, but we're not talking about discomfort. We're talking about torture, we're talking about rape, we're talking about beatings, we're talking about killings, really violent repression of people who dare to speak up.
Absolutely, and of course, what does this do to community? If you see people get killed because of standing up, of protecting the environment, and also, of course, their livelihoods and their way of living, and their values as a community. It's repression, it's intimidation, and then you force people into submission or into giving up, because no one who is brave enough to do that, but still people do it. Still they do it.
So how do you defend them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm researching that question, and I think you can answer that from a more civil society perspective. So you see NGOs actually acting in solidarity with these environmental defenders. You see Greenpeace paying more attention to their, to this problem, and Amnesty realizing that environmental defenders are human rights defenders because they defend also the human right to health, to life, the human right to freedom of expression and everything. So part of it, the answer is by really giving public attention to the fate of environmental defenders. If there is an environmental defender under threat, you have mechanisms that there is a massive outpouring of support, or letters to be written to the governments or to the state officials, so petitions to illuminate, like Amnesty tends to do, to say this is someone who is threatened by human rights violations, and we are aware of this, and we call upon you to act and to honor your obligations under international law. And this can have a real effect, public opinion pressure and naming and shaming can have a real effect in the personal safety of those environmental defenders. I would like that to become bigger. I would like this to become more in the conscience of the people, that these people need our solidarity and support. Also, Friends of the Earth is getting strong in paying attention to this and having campaigns to stand up for their environmental defenders. At the same time, legally, increasingly you see that, for example, the special rapporteur on human rights defenders and the special rapporteur on indigenous rights, which are UN agents, and the Committee for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights are all saying that the states have a duty to protect environmental defenders under international human rights law. Because under international human rights law, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, we have the right of expression, we have the right of assembly, we have the right of association. And environmental defenders, they exercise those rights on behalf of the environment. They use these rights, political rights, to give expression to their concern about the environment, and states have the duty to protect them when they exercise those rights, and to enable them when they exercise those rights, and to investigate cases when environmental defenders are harassed, when their human rights are violated, when they are murdered. So you see UN bodies actually speaking up and saying there is an obligation under law, under international law, for states to protect them. Yeah.
And this is a new development to some extent.
Maybe
growing
some growing development for the last maybe 5 to 7 years. This has been brought to the attention. I think for a long time the international community wasn't aware that environmental defenders are facing so much violence. It has come to the attention, it had to come to the attention, and it had to be recognized that they are human rights defenders. Mm-hmm. They are not per se environmental activists, but they are also human, they are both. They are also human rights defenders because it's a human rights issue. And framing it as a human rights issue gives them, helps to draw in the support of international human rights law. And it makes more clear what kind of obligations the state have. Of course, having those obligations and having special rapporteurs, reporting on them is one thing, and actually states doing it is another. So it's always like, how can we enforce those obligations? And then it has to do with, the economic system, with the power relationships, etc. I feel very strongly that the role that we individuals can play in this is very important. That, if I campaign to make ECOCIDE a crime, and that's also connected to environmental defenders because they are often ECOCIDE whistleblowers. I mean, often we're talking about ecocides there. So if ECOCIDE becomes a crime, it becomes illegal for companies to make money in a way that causes an ecocide. This will greatly help environmental defenders because they have to do with, they're confronted with the effects of ecocides or very big scale environmental pollution and destruction. So in that sense, it is connected to our ECOCIDE campaign. It's connected to the people who work for rights of nature. Yeah.
We're back to the interlinking roots, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there particular stories about environmental defenders that you feel have particularly strong feelings about? Are there individuals that, you know, we're talking about this in a fairly abstract way,
yes,
but
yes.
These are real individual people in particular situations. Are there examples that you would want to share about that?
Let me think. Well, yeah, in my TEDx talk I talk about the Indonesian farmer who was killed probably by security forces because he was protesting the damage they were doing to the forests with their agricultural operations. And then he was just 21 years old, and he was, you know, living there. He was a person who, because of circumstances, felt himself becoming an environmental defender, because often they are just living their lives, but they are faced with these encroachments upon their community, on their way of living, on their, you know, their economy. So they're forced by the facts to become that. It's often not a planned thing. So he started to raise awareness, and he was part of an alliance of farmers, and he was, it was like, I don't know if whistleblower is the right term, but he was, you know, trying to ring the alarm. And then he was killed, and he was just 21, and he was just trying to protect the interests of his community. And that, if you see his photo, you read the background, you're like, wow, it's a person who was working for the well-being of the people, the economic well-being, the environmental well-being, and he was killed, and there was no prosecution, there was no clarity there was no real police investigation, and this is of course not acceptable at all, that a human life is sacrificed for monetary interests. And I think we have ability here. I mean, I can work on these issues in all peace and quiet, you know. I can write about this, I can talk on TV or on, you know, on your website about this without any threats to my well-being and health. And I like to remind myself of that I have a privilege that I can do this, you know, also on behalf of others for whom it's very dangerous to do. So I can only do my small bit. But, you know, I think together, if we raise the awareness, it can change our thinking. And also, if we buy those products that are manufactured in such a way, we have to become aware of that. We have to become aware of the environmental costs and societal costs of what we consume. I mean, in the end, it's all to feed the consumption market, the consumer market. Yeah.
Which is us.
Which is us.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What can we also, something that we share in common, you as a Dutch person, me as a Canadian, is that our countries are responsible for quite a lot of this activity in the third world. I mean, the normal villain in an environmental catastrophe story in South America is a Canadian mining company, right? Yeah. And you've got international corporations headquartered here in this small country. What can we do in our own countries, you know, to help those people who are suffering from the actions of our companies in their countries?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think several things, but I think to put pressure on our politicians, on our representatives, to say that, you know, the rules of behavior that those corporations have to follow when they operate in our country, when they deal with our Dutch citizens, those rules should also apply, those standards should apply when they operate abroad too. I mean, companies should respect human rights also when they, of course also, I mean, these are universal human rights. They should use the same standards of behavior when they operate abroad. They will not pollute, our rivers in that massive scale because they cannot get away with it. How can it be they can get away with it in other countries? Is the life less valuable there than it is here? I mean,
The answer would be yes. And as a matter of fact,
that is the unacceptable reality.
Yeah.
But our country has legislation in place by which these companies have to abide, and you see also an international development to say that multinationals should honor human rights and they should honor the rights of human rights defenders. And it should not only be corporate social responsibility, there should be more hard law in place. So I think to put pressure on your politicians to take a stand on ECOCIDE, you know, what do they think about it? How can they really speak out? I mean, if they are against it, why are they against it? I mean, give reasons. How can you be against massive damage and destruction of the environment? How can you argument that? I think there are other ways to, you know, join NGOs that are protecting the rights of human rights defenders and be part of those petitions, be part of those solidarity campaigns. I mean, when the Dutch Greenpeace crew was arrested in Russia because they boarded a oil tanker, right? The Arctic 30, they are called. There was a huge, you know, campaign to support them and to urge the Russian government to release them. In the end, they were released, you know, and then it was very professionally set up by Greenpeace, of course. But then you see that I think a problem is that the people that are suffering the most, they don't have that organizational capacity, and they are not as well represented. So they need better representation. You know, they need more of our support. And the exact how is of a process, and I can give you some ideas I have and how I try to contribute to it, especially raise awareness about it. Yeah.
I was going to say that maybe raising awareness. Obviously, one of the big problems for a lot of these folks is that they are nobody knows about it, right? It's all happening silently in some remote place, and there's no media coverage and no. You know, and as you said of the Indonesian farmer, he didn't go seeking the problem came to him, right?
Exactly, yeah. But what we do see is that also with this global world, that with the power of social media, we have so much information available. You know, so it's people that work at such NGOs, they often get like WhatsApps, or they get alerts that something happened or something is about to happen, and they get it instantly, and then they can mobilize their networks. So using satellites to mobilize is a positive part of the globalized world we live in. Yeah, I think that everything counts. How you, what you consume, the choices you make, how you vote, but also as consumers we have huge power, and how we invest our money. You know, which bank does our bank enable? ECOCIDE, does our bank enable dirty energy, or does it invest in renewable energy? I mean, of course, the divestment movement is huge. It's really gaining ground, and it's using that argument to also help shift towards a more sustainable economic system. Yeah. Well, of course, in the climate case, we had this victorious moment, and it was wonderful, and the effects have been very positive. I mean, ripples of hope and inspiration around the world. And similar cases started in Belgium and in many other countries too, I think in Australia too. But the Dutch state has appealed, so it says, well, we're going to appeal because we don't think that the judge has that. We think the judge has overstepped its capacities. It has overstepped its authority with its ruling. It was too political. It was too extensive an interpretation of the articles. So the Dutch state is appealing against the climate case, and even though until we have a decision from a higher court, from an appeal court, this verdict is valid, so it's in place. It should be acted upon. But the Dutch state says, well, what we're going to do is we'll have a committee look at it in 2016 probably, and then they will look at it, if we should do something, what we should do, how we could lower the emissions if it's feasible, what about the economic recent developments, etc. And in short, they are not really acting upon it right now, and then it becomes the whole question of, it's about the balance of powers, and it's about the trios politica. So the judiciary is here, but the executive branch of government is there, and What is the real authority of this verdict? So that is a very interesting subject, especially for political scientists, I think, as well. At the same time, I mean, the verdict is there, and there will be an appeal, and they will have, again, a presentation of their arguments in court. And the Dutch state didn't oppose the Urgenda's presented facts. It didn't oppose the information about the CO2 emissions, and that needs to be lower, that we need to not go above the 2 degrees threshold. So it didn't oppose those. It actually agreed that it's happening and that it's needed. And the Dutch state itself has promised, that it would do more, and it has said it's urgent a couple of years back, but it's not acting upon its own promises. I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but I'm just saying the enforcement. You asked about the enforcement of the rules, right, and the verdict. Of course, that is the big issue. We have to wait for the Supreme Court decision ultimately to know what is the real ruling. But that takes years, and the whole problem is we don't have that time, really. Mm-hmm. That's the whole problem. There's urgency, but they're taking a route now that will take many more years. Yeah.
Since they didn't argue the facts, right? They didn't argue that the situation was as the Urgenda case described it. Yeah. Basically what they're saying, I guess, is that we agree that this is true, but we don't think that the court has the authority to direct us to do something about it.
That's right. They said that the court was treading on the field of politics, that this was a political issue, and the judge should apply the law, interpret the law, but it should not make law. So they said the judges are too much now the legislator. They're acting too much as a policy or legislator by telling us what we should do about this problem. And this is not the authority that they have, because we are the representatives of the people. We have our legitimacy, derived from the votes of the people, and the judges are appointed here. They have no democratic legitimacy, as we call it. But of course, the judge is there to uphold the rule of law and to apply the law and to put the legislation and the policy of the state along the rules we have in our international commitments and treaties, everything that is so-called hard law. And I think Roger Cox did a wonderful job in arguing that there is a existing obligation under hard law, under tort law, for a duty of care towards current and future generations with regards to CO2 emissions. And that is, of course, what the state's attorneys, they were arguing with that. They say there is not such a hardcore obligation, and Urgenda said there is, because of these reasonings, and they built their case very well. And it's interesting that just before the verdict of Urgenda, an international panel or group of highly esteemed judges and lawyers, they issued the Oslo Principles, basically saying there is a hard law obligation under international law for states to lower their CO2 emissions, for states to have a duty of care with regards to the atmosphere. And they said there is such a legal obligation under existing law. It's not futuristic, it is there. So this gave huge support for the legal reasoning. This is also the power of the collective. I mean, they dropped that just 2 weeks before the verdict. Yeah.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Is it, would the counter or the response to the government's position not be something like to say there is a theater in which politics reigns, but there are limits to that. That's what rights are about. That's what human rights are about.
Is about.
Yeah, that's right. And you may not, just because you have won an election, you may not infringe human rights, infringe basic values of the society. Those are beyond your.
Exactly.
Right?
That is the whole reasoning, that this freedom, this political freedom to, to make the laws of the land, and this democratic legitimacy they have in a rule of law system, in a rule of law world, is limited by the fundamental rights and freedoms of humans, and those cannot be sacrificed to the will of the majority, because they are human rights, they are fundamental rights, and the right to health or the right to life for sure is one of them. And it's the judge that is the one to uphold that framework, to ensure that the will of the majority doesn't violate those rights. So it's very much a human rights issue. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's become a human rights issue.
It's hard to see how you could argue too strongly with that.
Huh?
It's hard to see how you could argue too vigorously with that, but on the other hand,
I think it's all about how extensive or restrictive can a judge interpret provisions in the civil code. Because the judge has to apply law, but it interprets law when it does so. And what we've seen is that often judges interpret restrictively, so they are conservative in their interpretation of legal terms and words. What is duty of care? What does it entail? That's the whole question. Mm-hmm. But what this judge did, which was a surprise to me, is they dared to interpret more extensively. So they dared to have the whole body of international human rights law and the interests of future generations. They managed to read that into the provision, or to have that inform the provision of the duty of care. So the existing case law about this duty of care, they applied that to the subject of the atmosphere, but I think quite well, with a good foundation, with good arguments. But then the state says, well, this was overstepping the boundary. Yeah.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? But this is really the way that the law responds to completely changing circumstances.
Right.
I mean, our legal system has never before contemplated yours, anybody's, the situation we now face with respect to climate change. It's a brand new subject, and somehow making it,
I think lawyers in general are quite conservative breed of people, huh? Willing to listen to authority, to have authority arguments is very important values for lawyers. But law has to be in relationship with the reality of the world we live in, with the emergent realities and emergent urgencies. If it wants to be, how do you call it? If it wants to be. If it wants to be responsive to what is needed, if it wants to really protect human rights. I mean, otherwise it just becomes a document that offers no real protection to the worst kinds of threats of our lives and livelihoods and human rights. And that is impossible, because it's still in the service of mankind. It's something that should serve us to live together more peacefully, harmoniously, safely. It is not a idol, you know what I mean? In my opinion.
Femke Wijdekop, lawyer, researcher, and defender of those who defend the earth. People like Santiago Manuel Valera, one of our earlier Green interviews, who took 8 bullets while defending his ancestral lands. Femke was also a litigant in the Urgenda Foundation climate change case, a landmark legal action that inspired activists around the world. Coming up soon, interviews with Marianne Manesma, Urgenda's executive director, and with Roger Cox, the foundation's lawyer. I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining us.